Welcome, everyone. This is a child's right to safety versus a parent's right to raise their children, an ethical power struggle in child protective services. My name is Jay Rosenthal. Thank you. I am a child welfare consultant and founder of CPS Protects Consulting Services, a first-of-its-kind consulting firm helping families prepare for and navigate child protective services investigations. I'm also a former child protective services investigator. Today, we're going to go over the history of child protective services, from its origins to the present day. We will then examine actual cases, historical and more recent, where child protective services has failed. We'll take a look at child welfare today, and we will finish by examining how child protective services and the authority of child protective services to act and parental rights are in direct opposition, and what the right balance may be. Sorry about that. This quote by Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was a reporter for the New York Tribune back in the late 1800s. What he's describing here is the emotions amongst the jury in the courtroom of the very first Child Protective Services case, known as the Mary Ellen case. Mary Ellen Wilson was a 10-year-old girl. Shortly after birth, her father died. Her mother had to go to work, and she left Mary Ellen with a boarder. However, Mary Ellen's mother fell behind in payments, and the boarder, who was the equivalent of a nanny or babysitter, surrendered Mary Ellen to the government. Paperwork was not properly filed, chain of custody was not established, and Mary Ellen was placed with a couple that was highly abusive, and this went on for years. Child protection laws were not particularly robust, and the government elected not to interfere. Thankfully, there were a couple of good Samaritans who had some experience in cruelty prevention who helped rescue Mary Ellen. The reaction to her testimony, described by Jacob Riis, is a testament to how vulnerable children can be and how much of a virtue child protection is. It's important to keep in mind as we continue through each of the slides moving forward. So, child protective services investigations initially were carried out by local community organizations that resemble the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And it just so happens that in the first Child Protective Services case, it was the founder of the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, a man named Henry Berg, and their chief legal counsel, Elbridge Gerry, who helped lead the fight. Shortly after, in 1875, the very first formal child protective service, the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, was established in 1875. Take a minute for it to sink in that there was a Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals before there was one for the prevention of cruelty to children. Now, these societies for the prevention of cruelty to children started to spring up across the country. By 1925, there were 480 of them, almost 500. The government, however, continued to pass laws to increase children's rights. And in the 1960s, this network of societies for the prevention of cruelty to children started to falter. Some closed for lack of funding, others closed for lack of personnel, but the passion was not the same. At the same time, custodial abuse and neglect was decriminalized. While still illegal, it was no longer criminal. The family and juvenile courts were established, and over the next 20 years, the government of each state established their own central registry for child abuse and maltreatment, and delegated the responsibilities historically bestowed on the Societies for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children to their own social services agencies. By the 1980s, this transfer was essentially complete. Let's take a look at a much older case, the case of Willie Butts. In the fall of 1880, Willie was living with his parents as an only child in Brooklyn, New York. He had neighbors in his apartment building, Henry and Rosa Miller. The Millers were very fond of Willie and his parents, and they planned on moving out to Manorville, Long Island, which, if you're not familiar with New York geography, is not too far from the Hamptons. They wanted to take Willie with them. They said, we can give him the opportunity for hunting, for fishing, to go to school, to go to religious school, opportunities you might not necessarily be able to provide in Brooklyn. And after much discussion with Willie and his parents together, Willie decided to go. This was also in exchange for running a few errands here and there for the Miller family, a euphemism for child labor at the time. So Willie went to live with the Millers in Manorville, and the Millers sent periodic letters to Willie's parents saying that he was doing well. Fast forward to January 1881. A Good Samaritan and resident of Manorville contacted Willie's mother and said she saw him walking in the freezing cold 2.5 miles back from the general store to the Miller's home. He was barefoot, he looked sickly, and there were concerns that he might die. The next day, Willie's father rushed to Manorville to see him, and what he found was horrifying. Willie was in pain, not well fed, could barely walk. Took him to the hospital. It was there that a report was filed with the Brooklyn Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. As you can see by the picture of Willie, they had to amputate both of his feet at the ankle in order to save his life. As was characteristic at the time, the local Child Protective Service, the Brooklyn Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, took Willie's statement, teamed up with law enforcement, and obtained a warrant for the arrest of Henry and Rosa Miller. They were indicted and tried in the criminal court for their neglect of 9-year-old Willie. It is not known what happened to Willie after this, but I hope that he lived a full life. Let's talk about child welfare today. I'm going to throw some statistics out here. So in the United States today, there are about 330 million people. And of those 330 million or so people, there are approximately 61 million families with minor children. In 2019, there were 4.4 million reports made to child abuse and neglect hotlines in the United States. Of them, 2.2 million were investigated, and 29.7% were substantiated. Also, in 2019, there were almost 500,000 children separated by Child Protective Services across the country from their families. Kinship care, foster care, institutionalization. That's a lot of kids. Now, either parents are really bad at what they do, or we've gotten really sensitive and have a really low threshold for reporting nowadays. There was a 10-year study published in the American Journal of Public Health in 2017 that found that almost 4 in 10 children will experience a Child Protective Services investigation prior to reaching the age of 18 in the United States. That is an astonishing number. Let's talk about a few more recent cases. Started with Nix Mary Brown in 2006. Nix Mary Brown was a 7-year-old girl living in New York City. She had 5 siblings and her mother and stepfather. There were multiple prior investigations. And while under her last investigation by the local Child Protective Service, ACS, Nix Mary was murdered by her stepfather. He was frustrated with her noncompliance and held her under water as he reported he had endured his punishment as a child. The cycle of abuse continues. She hit her head on a faucet, and it's believed that's what caused her death. Now, in hindsight, this looks like negligence, and it may indeed be on behalf of ACS. However, what if when the investigator goes in, the apartment looks clean, the children are not cowering in front of their parents, and they go to ask the doctor, and the doctor says, well, they missed their annual physical last year, but last time I saw them, I had no concerns for child abuse or neglect. Sometimes Child Protective Services can be negligent, and other times they do make their diligent efforts, and still there are children like Nix Mary who slip through the cracks. Let's take a look at another case. Sophia Faye Davis. This is this year. She was 1-year-old. Illinois Department of Children and Family Services investigated. There was 1 prior substantiated case. Now, in January of 2022, Sophia's mother had picked her up from visitation with her father and found suspicious marks and bruises. Sensibly, she had a doctor check them out immediately. The doctor, being a mandated reporter, reported this to Illinois' State Central Register, and an investigation was initiated. DCFS failed to come up with enough evidence that the allegations were true and planned to unsubstantiate the case. Visitation resumed. What DCFS didn't know was that the father's girlfriend was frustrated with the child, and at the next visit, the girlfriend actually beat Sophia to death. Once again, Child Protective Services failed to protect Sophia. Lastly, let's take a look at Trinity Chandler. This is from 2020. She was 3 years old. Michigan's Department of Health and Human Services came to investigate based on a report. Prior to her death, a welfare check was performed by the local police department. Injuries had been documented, but nothing was done. The autopsy had revealed that she died of blunt force trauma to the heart. Once again, the boyfriend is implicated here. Now, why didn't the police remove or alert Child Protective Services? Sometimes there is a failure in communication across departments. It is not excusable, but unfortunately, Trinity Chandler fell through the cracks. That brings us to the impossible choice. In every single one of those more recent cases, those 3 cases that you saw, they were major news stories. There was significant public outrage. Keeping in mind now that Child Protective Services is performed primarily by the government in the United States. When something like this happens, the government wants to act, and what they have control over is Child Protective Services. So in every case, there are promises to increase the authority of Child Protective Services to act to prevent something like this from ever happening again. It just so happens, however, that parental rights are in direct opposition to CPS authority. The more authority CPS has, the better they can respond, but the less rights you have as a parent. So I ask you this: how much of your parental rights are you willing to give up so that CPS can have the authority to prevent all child abuse and neglect? Don't answer that. If you're not willing to give up any of your parental rights so that CPS can have more authority, then these children will continue to fall through the cracks. There is never going to be perfection. However, when we communicate for Child Protective Services, when we say we want all child abuse and neglect gone, and if you screw up, we're going to be outraged about this, the government is going to receive the wrong message here. It is important to be consistent. This is not a comfortable conversation to have for anyone, but a necessary one if we want to be able to raise our children and honor the virtue of protecting children. After this talk today, after this conference, when you go home, think about what this looks like in your communities, your town, your school. There's a reason that Child Protective Services is primarily handled at the state level, sometimes at the local level. The smaller the community, the more universal the values. Think about what you are looking for. For those of you that advocate, for those of you that have children, that care about your children, think about what you want. Because with as prevalent as Child Protective Services investigations are, it's only a matter of time before it might be you wanting to exercise your rights. If anyone's interested in the sources for this talk, in the slides that we have uploaded, you can certainly click on the links and look everything up. And now I will take questions.